Greetings and salutations, Elwood City Limits listeners. Or perhaps I should be saying bienvenue, bonjour, maybe, because today is something a little different for the free feed. It's Will Young here, and as I have previously explained on Elwood City Limits, June here on the show is a little bit of a vacation month. Lucas is on vacation far away. I'm going to be taking a little time off here as well. But we didn't want to leave too many gaps in content. Unfortunately, we do have a gap week on the Patreon, patreon.com/Elwood City Limits. But the Patreon is where you would have heard this episode months ago. Near the beginning of the year, we had our second episode of our newer Patreon series, Elwood City Limits Origins. This is the show where Lucas and I talk about television shows, cartoons really, that influenced us beyond the scope of PBS Kids. So with these episodes, our goal is to go into something that we know a lot about. For the Kids of PBS Kids podcast, which is our other sister series to ECL, is a show where often we go in blind. We don't know what to expect, and it's meant to look at the contemporaries of Arthur and what came before Arthur and what came after it. With ECL Origins, we pretty much know what we're getting into. I think there's going to be some times coming up where Lucas knows a little bit more about a show or I know a bit more about the show. But this time, we both knew what we were talking about. For years, we've been talking about doing about some kind of content about a little weird, very French, kind of disgusting cartoon from our childhoods called Yvon of the Yukon. And with ECL Origins, we finally had the output. Now, this is not the only episode of this show that we have done so far. We have done episodes on SpongeBob SquarePants, Stickin' Around. Our latest one was on Homestar Runner, and we have a lot more fun plans to go. In fact, July, we're going to be picking a new ECL Origins episode. We're not sure what we're going to be doing yet there, but for now, make sure that if you like this, if you like this kind of content, if that sounds good to you, go to patreon.com/Elwood City Limits and sign up over there. And I'm just going to take a moment here, if you don't mind. There are several fine people who have signed up at patreon.com/Elwood City Limits and are paying whatever they want for access to shows like this, early access to shows like this, such as John Dulong and John Griswold. People like Kevin Noon and Jake Bailey. People like Lily W. and Nicholas DeMarco. People such as Greenhouse Vinyls and Casey Cosmos. People like Zara and Young Wee and JP. Thank you to people such as Jack, Jeff L. and Jared G. Thank you to Mamata and Alicia. And thank you to Tiki Barberfan, our newest patron. Thanks, everybody, for joining in at patreon.com/Elwood City Limits. And without much further ado, I'm just going to get to it. Here is the second episode of ECL Origins, where you are going to learn a little bit about a show called Yvon of the Yukon. Hope you enjoy, and we'll see you soon for more Elwood City Limits and our sister shows over on the Patreon. Also, a quick note, this episode has a bit of spicy language in it. This is normally what you get behind the paywall, and we are talking about some gross-out/toilet humor in a bit of detail. So please be forewarned, but otherwise, enjoy.
There once was a Frenchman, Yvon was his name. Exploring new worlds he dreamed was his fame. But reading a map was not his forte. So poor Yvon was soon cast away. Yvon of the Yukon, sailing the stormy seas. Yvon of the Yukon, no one could hear his pleas.
He soon found himself in a bit of a pickle.
The frigid North Seas proved more than fickle.
Yvon's navigation would soon cost a price.
He was knocked overboard
and turned into ice.
Yvon of the Yukon, half was volunteer. Yvon of the Yukon, frozen for hundreds of years. 300 years passed, and with some irony,
his pee was thought out by mutts need to pee.
Yvon claimed the land for his country's glory, and that's the start of Yvon's story. Yvon of the Yukon, frozen by icy seas. Yvon of the Yukon,
defrosted for you and for me.
Will, you know how the Assassin's Creed games always start with a warning that says Assassin's Creed, Ubisoft is a melting pot of different ethnicities and racial backgrounds and religious creeds. It is a diverse product. I feel like we need a warning in front of this episode of ECL Origins to say that, we are merely looking at Yvon of the Yukon from an editorial perspective. You and I have egalitarian values. We do not discriminate against any nationality, even if you're French.
No, we certainly don't. I'd like to think that our track record has shown that in the past. But in case anybody wasn't sure, since for this one we're asking people to check out a piece of Canadian history that certainly is quite different. Some 25 years later, and finally, we get to talk about it. This is ECL Origins. This is one of two Patreon-exclusive podcasts. Will Young here with Lucas Mancini, and something we've been wanting to talk about since the first year of this podcast. We would mention it offhand. There's a couple of cartoons that we have planned for this little side series that have been in our minds for a long time, and finally, it's time to talk about a little-remembered piece of Canadian gross-out cartoon history, and that's Yvon of the Yukon.
Yeah, it's funny, you say little remembered, and it's true. I feel like Yvon, for one reason or another, has completely exited the public consciousness, even amongst cartoon fans, even amongst Canadian cartoon fans. But I don't know if it was a time or place thing for me, but this show left quite the impression on me and my friend group. Yvon started airing in 2001, ran from 2001 to 2004. My prime, as we went over in the SpongeBob episode, my prime cartoon watching years.
Yeah.
And it is something that has been a bit of a punchline, both, even on ECL and amongst friends in my peer group. Remember that disgusting show about that really nasty Frenchman with all of the weird kind of portrayals of French people and Chinese people and people of all sorts of different nationalities. Wasn't that weird? Wasn't that show weird? And it never really went further than that, though. None of us have ever gone back to actually watch Yvon of the Yukon. It's just kind of like a nightmare I once had or something like that. But it's never quite left my mind. Like, even as a kid, it's one of those shows. I would say it's the Canadian version of. Are you familiar with a show called Mega Babies?
Of course I am. Of course I am. It's one of the Teletoon early Teletoon classics in quotation marks.
Yeah, so I would think it shares a peer group with Mega Babies, the Ripping Friends.
Yeah.
Gross out animation. Sort of shows that go a step above what perhaps a SpongeBob, or even, SpongeBob's more, I would say, a little bit more edgier companion, Ren and Stimpy. I feel like Mega Babies, Ripping Friends, and Yvon, the most Canadian entry in those three shows, kind of go a step further with the bodily humor, with the gross out humor. We're talking poop, pee, underwear, wedgies,
snot, hair,
real some garbage pail kid stuff. Almost even again beyond the garbage pail kid pale, and going into like Adam Sandler territory. There was a couple of moments in this episode. We watched the pilot today, and I was like, some of these jokes are reminiscent of moments from the film that me and you love to talk about, 8 Crazy Nights. There's some
which is
8 crazy,
which is also from around this time, like 2001-ish.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually a really good point, Will. I feel like this type of gross out cartoon has kind of gone the wayside. I don't think it really exists anymore. You look at today's modern day cartoons meant for kids at this era. It's your Amazing World of Gumballs. It's your Craig of the Creeks. Go a little bit younger, it's Bluey. But there's not really
Or older.
or older, right? Yeah, for Bluey. But damn, are we gonna have to talk about Bluey on here one of these days? Anyway, there's not really a contemporary show about hairy butts or nasty farts.
No, it's so. Yes, in that sense, this show is kind of very much of a time. As you were talking about it too, it's interesting to compare this to the cartoon landscape today. At least I guess as we see it, it's tough to know exactly because I feel like as kids we were far more dialed into like the cartoons on television, and now you kind of hear about it more like the popular ones, or at least the ones that are making the most buzz on social media. That's kind of how we know about them. And I wonder if there are as many cartoons where it kind of like it kind of just came and went, and that was more of the idea. Like, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that Yvon of the Yukon wasn't exactly trying to be representative or say something. It was just kind of trying to entertain in a very specific way. And then once it was done, it was done. I don't believe that this was anybody's like dream project. Whereas, a lot of cartoons today are like, the ones that make it to TV, and even some of the ones that become very successful are like, this is something that somebody has wanted to make for a very long time. It's an idea they've had for a long time, an idea that they've pitched again and again, and then and it becomes like a big thing. Like, your Adventure Times, Steven Universes, like all that kind of stuff. This is very much of the type where you kind of watch it and you're not supposed to really think about it that hard. We'll get into this a bit later. I did do some research on this show because it's just to say that I did, especially because we're going to be presenting this to some people probably for the first time. And I felt that I should kind of explain a little bit about what went into it, but there's really not a lot of information. There's nothing online that I could find that's just like, oh yeah, the creators really, felt strongly about this. It seems to be very much like space needed to be filled. They had an idea and they decided to go with it. Certainly to go along with your point about like the gross out humor, which we will talk about. That's a very 90s thing. And even though this was 2001, I'm sure some of its development went on in the late 90s. There doesn't seem to be like a real market for kids gross out anymore. And I think that's probably due to a lot of things. That's probably a whole other podcast in and of itself, but it really not hits different. That's not what that means, but like it feels different watching it outside of its own time.
Yeah, a little antiquated, perhaps.
Yeah,
or just not of its era.
Yeah.
Now, I do want to push back on some stuff you said. For instance, you said the show isn't really saying anything. I would counter that by saying the show's ideology is clear as day. French people are disgusting. And that was one of the things that was really weird to me returning to it, was that, for our American listeners, sure, they might be familiar with Mega Babies and Ripping Friends, but this is one gross out show that's definitely new to them because it is a through and through a Canadian production. It's written by Canadians, it's performed by Canadians, it takes place in Canada. In fact, it was I'm reading now, funded significantly funded by our tax dollars. I was like, did someone on this show like really hate French Canadians or something?
Well, and not French Canadians, like the French. So this Yvon is not French Canadian, although he is in Canada.
Right.
This is specifically like Parisians that they don't like.
But here's the thing about French Canadians, right? Is Yvon is from pre-colonial times. Right? And, when people talk about the French-Canadian accent and how it sounds so different than Parisian accent, the Parisian accent, one of the things they talk about is that it's like what French sounds like out of time. Like, French people used to sound like how French-Canadians sound. Oh, yeah. But the accent evolved over being part of Europe, whereas French-Canadians, they sound really strange to Parisian Canadians. So a part of me is like, I don't know enough about because I'm such a woke person, Will, for lack of a better term, and I have so much love in my heart for, as an Anglo, for our French Canadian brethren. I couldn't even begin to cite examples of French Canadian stereotypes to you, but I was wondering if Yvon embodies some sort of stereotype, because the thing is, even though he is supposed to be from the age of Louis the 15th. He wears like modern day toque, modern day underwear, and often, and this is something that's kind of strange to a lot of Americans. In some regions in Canada, it's the French Canadians are the lower income people, right? Like, so in provinces like New Brunswick, the lower income areas tend to be the French Canadian areas, and this is in part due to all sorts of political reasons, underfunding of those areas by the provincial government there. And there's also, a lot of, this is very novel to Americans, but like low income people in rural Quebec who people aren't used to, people with a French accent being from that kind of area, right? Being from like trailer parks and stuff. So a part of me in the back of my head, I was like, did someone have a really bad experience, or just like a hatred for French Canadians, and that's where this came from? But I don't know. That's probably just a pet theory. Maybe they thought, a stinky old Frenchman is funny, and he would fart a lot, and that would be funny. That's probably more the case. The other thing I wanted to say is that you said that there was not necessarily any representation of the show, and that's what's interesting of this show. Besides being, besides portraying the French is so absolutely repulsive, and it's not just Yvon too. Whenever they cut back to France, they do it in the episode we watched today, the pilot, but I remember them doing it all the time. Like, King Louis is not portrayed in a positive light. Like, he is as gross as Yvon and disgusting in his own right.
Yeah.
But despite the French getting such a raw deal, the protagonists of the show are all Inuit, and it kind of takes place in a majority Inuit community, which for 2001, I remember when we were talking about Molly of Denali, and kind of how refreshing that show was. There was certainly nothing like this back in 2001. And some of the actors, and you might get into this later when we talk about the creation of it a little bit, but I was looking up, some of the actors are indeed Indigenous.
Yes.
So
there's a couple of actors that are playing outside of their race, let's say, and not just on the Indigenous side. But that's a good point. Like, there's actually a little bit of unremarked upon diversity, like true diversity, in the sense that like characters of every racial background get to be more well-rounded, and also like it's not made a big thing out of, as we'll talk about.
Yeah. I do think, whether they're being voiced by someone of their race or not, a lot of, and in my memory, the Inuit characters are the ones who are given the most dignity. In a show where the dignity is few and far, you know what I mean? Dignity is not being doled out in droves in this show, but what crumbs of dignity there are available are afforded to the Indigenous characters.
Yes. Tommy and Big Bill are often like the more level-headed among the cast.
I feel like we need to give, we put the cart before the horse because we have so many Yvon takes. I guess we should give a really basic, and this is maybe a good opportunity to talk about the opening, because the opening really lays out Yvon's origin story, because some of our American listeners are probably listening to this being like, what the hell are they talking about?
So the cartoon Yvon of the Yukon, as Lucas said, it debuted in April 2001, ended in January 2004, 3 seasons, 52 episodes. So before I talk about any behind the scenes stuff, the basic plot line is that Yvon is I'm not so good about like denoting times, like even the King Louis here I wasn't so clear on, but essentially he is a Frenchman from hundreds, I think Tommy at one point in this episode is like 300 something years ago, so of that era of France. He went on a voyage across the sea to what is now the I don't think they necessarily say, but let's say the northern part of Canada, and froze in a block of ice, Captain America style, and then was thawed out 300 some years later by Tommy. And this is all in the opening credits. Like they do the theme song, and so they roll back the story because the because the show is not about really Yvon, like a story. It's very episodic. It's very just meant to be situational comedy. And yeah, so Yvon was frozen out of the block of ice by Tommy's dog Mutt, who we don't see in this episode, peeing on the ice and unfreezing Yvon. And so he's alive. He's just this displaced squat Frenchman who is in this indigenous/northern community, and hilarity ensues from there.
Yes. Another important thing to point out is that Yvon is never wearing pants.
Yes.
He is always donning his briefs, his tighty-whitey style briefs. They are not boxers, and this is never really remarked upon or acknowledged by anybody else. I don't know if the joke here is this is his French custom, but he is always in his underwear.
Yes. He's meant to be kind of this very uncouth character who has a very prominent French accent, like means well, but is also like fairly gross and just kind of doesn't understand the modern world as it was in 2001.
Yeah, it's that kind of like almost Austin Powers dynamic where Yvon is both a man out of time as well as a man out of his natural habitat. He's a fish out of water. He's not in France, and so the residents of this town in the Yukon have a lot to learn from Yvon as much as he does from them. And like you said, Will, hijinks ensue as a result.
Well, and that's actually a terrific comparison that I didn't even think of, and I wouldn't be surprised if, by the time Yvon of the Yukon was probably getting, in the preliminary stages, Austin Powers was already very popular. The first movie came out in 1997 and proved to be like a cultural phenomenon of the time. So I can't imagine they didn't take at least a little bit of inspiration from that. That's actually a really good comparison there. So this is the first instance of saying that, to my knowledge, neither of the creators of the show are indigenous. I believe they are white. Mm-hmm. I could be wrong. I'm not their biographer. The creators of the show are two voice actors, Ian James Corlett and Terry Clausen. We've actually talked about Ian James Corlett on For the Kids before. He's a voice actor that no doubt, if you have been alive since the 1990s, you've heard him in something. He was the voice of Mega Man. He was one of the voices of Goku on Dragon Ball Z. He was on Reboot. He was on What's with Andy. And he's the creator of Being Ian, which we talked about. And as we found out live on the show, is like, it's about being Ian James Corlett.
Yes, he's the titular Ian.
He's the titular Ian. And Terry Clausen is another voice actor who has been, a bunch of stuff. He's been a voice director. So he and Ian James Corlett also worked on script localizations for overseas shows through their own company. So they worked on the localizations of shows like Cyber 6, Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, Bakugan, Beyblade. So they have, they're working partners and had been for quite a while before Yvon of the Yukon. So again, I wasn't really able to find any like whys or even really hows. Just kind of, I guess they just had this idea. And we've encountered that before with For the Kids. It's like sometimes somebody just has an idea. It's not like an idea they've been married to for their whole life, but they just kind of get the green light and go ahead with it, and it ends up being at least mildly successful.
Something I want to share also with our American viewers, I mentioned this earlier, just because it's so funny to me, is that one of the reasons there's so many Canadian children's television shows compared to American children's television shows, there's a long-standing Canadian connection with Arthur. So much children's programming comes out of Canada, and it's because of the way our arts funding works and how there's so much funding available for people to work in animation and children's programming. And so it's just so funny to me looking at this Wikipedia article and how much of Yvon of the Yukon was funded by you and I, Will, the taxpayer, because it was produced with the participation of the Canadian Television Fund and the Canadian Film and Video Production Tax Credit, with the assistance of the British Columbia Film and Film Incentive BC grant, and participation from the province of British Columbia. So almost entirely crowd corporation, nonprofit, and just straight up government funding is what brought us, this great Canadian cultural artifact, Yvon of the Yukon.
Right. And of course, as we've mentioned many times, Ian James Corlett, Terry Clausen, most of the people who worked on this show, very Canadian. Also Canadian is the studio that produced it. That would be Studio B. Now, Studio B is part of what is now called Wild Brain, which just kind of gobbled up a lot of different Canadian production houses throughout the years. So this particular animation studio worked on a lot of 90s cartoons that surely you recognize. Now, I'm kind of ignorant of the entire process of animation. So this particular studio often animated a few episodes of a show, of a series, as opposed to being the animators or producers of a whole thing. So they've worked on shows like the Beetlejuice cartoon, Eek the Cat, The Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, the Mask animated series, Street Sharks, The Twisted Tales of Felix the Cat, The Angry Beavers, Corduroy, Being Ian. So, like, a bunch of 90s, early 2000s cartoons. This was just another one that they also happened to work on. In my research, Lucas, I was very interested to find Yvon of the Yukon actually won a couple of awards, if you can believe it. So it won what's called a Leo Award in 2002 for the Best Youth or Children's Program or Series. I would love to see the competition that year. It also has some Best Director and Writers Guild of Canada awards under its belt as well.
As anybody, our Americans, look up the winners of the Genie Awards, or what was one of them was TV, one of them was movie. There was the Genie, and then what was the other one, Will? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Junos? Are you thinking of the Junos?
The Junos still exist. I thought there was one of them.
You mean defunct?
Yeah, because the Genie doesn't exist anymore.
No,
Genie Awards.
The Genie Awards, yes. That's a good question. That's actually.
I think the Genie Awards were both. Actually.
Oh, okay.
Oh no, the Gemini Awards.
Gemini Awards. That's it. Yes.
Anyway, sometimes in Canadian media, it's slim pickings. We just got to give the biggest Canadian production its due. But I will say this about Yvon of the Yukon. Again, it's of its time and place. It's hard for us to go into the mindset of, maybe this filthy yet lovable Frenchman, captured the hearts and minds of the Canadian show business intelligentsia, and it earned those awards. Right. Who knows?
Well, and so I think it's worth mentioning that the Leo Awards are like based around British Columbia, like the British Columbia Media Awards. So I'm glad you mentioned that earlier because it's very much BC, western part of Canada, very much representative of that part of the country.
That's so funny. The show that the government funded. You're telling me that's the best cartoon that we got? Interesting.
Not much to say about the cast. There's a bunch of longtime Canadian voice actors in there. I just wanted to mention a couple. So the voice of Yvon is I looked him up. I don't recognize him from anything else. His name is Drew Reichelt. His biggest credit, aside from being Yvon on 52 episodes, he had a main role on a cartoon called RoboCop Alpha Commando, which I've never seen a second of.
Is it licensed actual RoboCop?
It's actual RoboCop.
Huh.
It's like a Canadian-produced RoboCop cartoon, which there was a lot of not lost, but not ill-forgotten RoboCop media from the 90s. There was the live-action Canadian-produced TV show. There was RoboCop 3, which is no good and nobody wants to think about. There's the RoboCop toys, and it was kind of a thing for a little while, or not a thing. I think it wanted to be a thing. Tommy, the character, is voiced by a Canadian voice actor that has unfortunately passed away. His name is Kirby Morrow, and much like Ian James Corlett, if you were aware of voice actors in the 90s, and if you were watching cartoons in the 90s, you've heard Kirby Morrow before. So he was on, and even just to hear him in Yvon of the Yukon, he's an incredibly recognizable voice. He did voices on Inuyasha, Escaflowne, Death Note, Gundam Wing. He was also a voice of Goku on Dragon Ball Z. Just really, really popular voice actor from Canada.
It's funny that this show, has connections to both Canadian Gokus. Yeah. There's the show was created by Goku up until 160, and then it, the main character is voiced by Goku from 160 onwards. That's just such a weird piece of trivia that Yvon of the Yukon is so Goku heavy.
Yes, very much so, and you can definitely hear the different eras of Goku because Ian James Corlett is also a voice in the show, although he doesn't sound like some of his more normal voices. The other person in the cast I wanted to shout out is actually a bit of a local connection here, and that would be the actor Glenn Gould. Not that Glenn Gould, a different one. He is the voice of Big Bill. He is an Indigenous voice actor from Sydney, Nova Scotia, which is where a lot of my family is from. So Lucas and I are in the capital of Nova Scotia, Halifax, or Dartmouth in Lucas's case, which is just across the water. And then if you go like 4 or 5 hours to the northeast of where we are, that's, you enter into what's called Cape Breton, and the capital of Cape Breton is Sydney, and that's where a lot of my family is from. So I wanted to give props to, and I think his Bill voice is tremendous. We hear a lot from Bill in this episode. I love that voice.
I know. I'm inspired. I think we need to grab the old Yellow Pages and see if we can get in touch with Mr. Glenn Gould. I would love to pick his brain about voice acting, the Yvon of the Yukon, and more. I'm also reading here that his uncle was, not to dwell on this too much because it's a very heavy subject, but his uncle was Donald Marshall Jr., who is a very important figure in Mi'kmaq history here in Nova Scotia, as someone who was wrongfully convicted of murder, opened up a lot of questions about the justice system here in Nova Scotia and how it treats Indigenous people. And this was like something I had to learn about in sociology class or in Mi'kmaq studies when I was in high school. So a really important figure in Indigenous history here in Nova Scotia. And it's funny, his nephew is Glenn Gould of Yvon of the Yukon fame.
And Glenn Gould's granddaughter, I believe, is also involved in entertainment one way or the other. So the family continues to work in at least Canadian entertainment. So otherwise, there's some notable voice actors in here. But what we really want to do is get into the meat of the show. I tried to do as much research as I could on the show. That's really about as much as I could do. If you have any other info about Yvon of the Yukon, some insider tips, let us know. But otherwise, let's round out talking about the theme song. So the episode actually, it has a cold open and then it goes into the theme song. But we already kind of started talking about it. It is just the summation of how Yvon got to the Yukon, and it's a very catchy theme song. It's memorable if nothing else. It also makes use of some very unusual instruments that you wouldn't hear on any other kids show, simply because of the fact that Yvon is French.
What are some of these instruments? This is interesting. I noticed the theme song is unusual, but I couldn't quite pick my finger down why.
So I mean, the main thing is that there's a lot of accordion, and I think that's a very almost stereotypically French instrument. So there's a lot of accordion, and there's a flute or a pipe, a pan pipe in the background as well to kind of give some little lilts here and there, which gives that kind of colonial vibe from where Yvon is coming from. Just really interesting touches, and we hear that throughout the episode and the score in the background. Because the accordion and the pipe go crazy on this show at certain times. So it's a little bit talk singy at times. I couldn't find out who's the singer of this theme song, but it is very he sings it very well, and it's very catchy, and you know exactly what Yvon's deal is in a minute flat, so it does its job. And
it's very call and response too, kind of like the SpongeBob theme. There's the Yvon of the Yukon, and it's almost again like the SpongeBob theme. It's almost sea shanty-esque.
Yes.
We have there's multiple different singers, and there's the one baritone guy who's he defrosted for you and for me. Yeah. Also, some of the imagery of this theme song is just burned in my brain. I feel like I've seen this theme song so much more than I've actually watched the show. And for those of you who are curious, listen, if what we've been talking about thus far sounds like your bag, knock yourself out. Personally, I would recommend if you want everything you need to know about Yvon and the Yukon, you can kind of just watch this theme and save yourself 20 minutes of like butt jokes. But some of these images, like Yvon getting kicked away by the king, or
Getting
when
pecked
he's
by
like,
vultures.
Yes, the shot of him getting pecked by vultures and the vultures like tearing at his red burnt skin. It's so gross. Like even as a child,
yeah.
like his weird like thin limbs and like his skin getting pulled away by the vultures. And then of course that dog peeing on him.
Which is only just a sousant for things to come.
Like, it's funny. It's the perfect theme song for this show.
Totally.
Like, both visually, both instrumentally and musically, everything you need to know, including the anti-French sentiment. Everything you need to know about Yvon of the Yukon is summed up in this theme song. It's a perfect cartoon theme song. Credit where credit is due. Also, he plants the French flag, and for some reason, the French tricolor is instead, it's like an underwear design. Right.
It's very a lot. I think one of the biggest compliments we can pay this show in general is that for what it is, it does it very well. Just what it is may not be to most people's likings. Something else that we kind of touched on but didn't continue on. So Lucas, you and I both watched this as kids. This is something that we're both coming into history with. You were mentioning how this is something you and your friends used to watch. You would have been probably like 7 or 8 or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
so I would have been watching this when I was like 11 or 12, and I also just really liked the show. Like, I watched it all the time. And, in retrospect, I'm like, why? But of course, it's like, A, because I'm a kid. B, because at the time, watching television was a lot different. Because if you wanted to watch cartoons, in Canada, in Eastern Canada, you had YTV. Sometimes they were on Fox Kids. Depending on your cable package, maybe you had Teletoon. And maybe they'd be on CBC once in a while. Or you could go watch PBS. But it's like, if you wanted to watch cartoons at 6 o'clock on a Monday, it's Yvon of the Yukon or nothing. And it is very much like, it definitely appeals to a young boy's sensibilities of what's funny, or at least the kind of stereotype of what's funny to young boys. So let's talk about it. The episode.
Well,
yeah.
I just want to say that you make a good point about the options, because we talked a little bit about this on our SpongeBob episode. But in Canada, there's such distinct blocks of programming for the different cartoon TV stations. Like, every Canadian knows what is a Family Channel show, what's a Teletoon show, and what's a YTV show. And Yvon of the Yukon, to an extreme degree, is a YTV show. Like, YTV's whole aesthetic of it's gross, it's nasty, it's for boys. Yvon of the Yukon is, that and then
So, I just on a whim here, I searched up YTV May 2001, which is a month after this started airing. And thanks to the YTV Schedule Archives wiki, I have the other shows that would have aired along with Yvon of the Yukon. So I'm not gonna say all of them here, but I do want to give you a little bit of an idea of so you're coming home from school. School ends at 3:15, 3:30, something like that. You're getting home around let's say 4. So starting at 4 o'clock on YTV, you've got Sticking Around. You've got Rugrats, Hey Arnold, Pokemon, Digimon, Powerpuff Girls. You've got Grizzly Tales for Gruesome Kids. You've got Dragon Ball Z, Big Wolf on Campus, Freaky Stories, Goosebumps, and of course it changes depending on the day and depending on the season. But that's kind of, and then Yvon of the Yukon is in there as well depending on the night. So that's sort of what the TV landscape looked like for us at the time of this airing. This is the first episode of Yvon of the Yukon. By the way, if you search up any episode of Yvon of the Yukon, it is readily available on YouTube for legally. It doesn't seem to be an illegal upload of any kind. So go nuts. The one we watched is called Call of the Mild, Season 1, Episode 1, aired April 28th, 2001. One thing I want to make note of here as we go along in the different segments of the episode that we watched, there's two things that I kept track of, Lucas, and I found them both in abundance, and that's gross out moments and adult gags. So gross out moments meaning the moments that are meant to disgust you, and adult gags meaning I'm kind of surprised they got away with this on a kid's show.
Yes. Okay, so that was the thing. Returning to this, it almost feels like an adult cartoon, like a Simpsons or a Family Guy.
A little bit, yeah.
At some point, someone says crap, Will. I can't even believe that.
I couldn't. It seemed close enough, and there's other instances that I was also very surprised by. So, in the very beginning of the episode, the cold open is that Tommy, who is a young Inuit boy in the Yukon, he's about probably like preteen. He's friends with Yvon. He receives a Charles Hercules chest expander in the mail, so like Charles Atlas kind of thing. It's one of those resistance band pull apart things. So our first gross out moment of the show is that Yvon is cooking some kind of concoction in a giant cauldron, and then he sneezes into it, whatever he's cooking.
Oh,
oh, Lucas, we got so much more to go, man.
I know.
There's so much worse to come. I'm so sorry. So we talked about Yvonne's design a little bit. How about his accent? It's very thick, and I actually quite liked listening to it.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. I'm not gonna lie.
Just this like I am it's like I am making my famous caribou kebabs, like as broad as you can get. It's clearly. The other gross out moment in this little part here is where Yvon is trying out this chest expander, and it gets caught in his chest hair, and so Tommy has to yank it out, and you see the chest hair come out at like the root.
Because as naturally as we know, French people are all hairy and disgusting.
Yes.
They're all covered in hair and filthy.
The one adult gag in this part is that Yvon references a brassiere. It's not as bad as it'll get, but he does mention that like the packaging of the chest expander is as complicated as like a brassiere or something to that effect. Mm-hmm. But he says it in that French accent, so it's a little hard to parse. The idea behind this episode is that Tommy is very insecure that he doesn't have any hair on his armpits. He doesn't have any beard hairs. He feels like he isn't manly. So this ends up with his father, who owns a restaurant in town called Mad Cossacks. Big Bill, who is like this big indigenous guy. I love his design. He invents an Inuit manhood test, which will require Tommy to spend 48 hours alone in the nearby tundra. So, man, where do I...
Which he says is like an ancient ritual, but it's obvious he's reading off the back of like a car magazine.
Yeah. It's pretty classic sitcom setup here.
We get a flashback where Yvon is being tortured by King Louis XV.
Yes.
And again, this is just so indicative of the humor of this show. Mm-hmm. He's getting a wedgie, like an atomic wedgie, and it's being like pulled back by a matter of yards.
Yes. Now this I remembered all the way back from childhood. I don't know why. You just hold on to the stupidest things when you're a kid. I just remembered, oui, mon majesty, will you accept 3 yards? Oui. And then it's literally showing like an executioner like winding back the band of the underwear to a sign that says 3 yards, and then they snap it. That's one of the gross out moments of this part that I put down there. We actually have the main character fart, like audibly fart. Like the very beginning of the episode is Tommy doing one of the classic gym class situations that I actually never had to do, but always feared because of children's TV, and that's climbing a rope. So like a rope that's attached to the ceiling and having to army climb it. I never had to do that. Did you?
I did have to do that. At least I think I did. I don't know if I have false memories from cartoons, but I could have sworn I had to do that.
So Tommy embarrasses himself by farting. There's this elongated scene where Tommy is in the shower, and we literally see like the naked butts of children. Now, it's gonna sound weird. I'm not saying it's not, but that's literally what's happening. It's like Tommy showering after gym class, and then his classmates are in there. They all have very exaggerated designs. One's like rotund and with red hair. Another's like really skinny with braces and floppy blonde hair. And you see like a lot of naked butts going on. In fact, there's almost full nudity at times. And this is where we get another adult gag, because one of Tommy's classmates is like talking about, where you can get hair or like the things that make you a man. He turns around and shows his butt to the camera and he says, "Asteroids?"
That's crazy. I didn't even catch that. Like, that's what I'm saying is that doesn't feel like a show that would be on the afternoon on YTV. It feels, dare I say, Family Guy-esque.
Well, right. And there's a couple of instances in the show where it's like they're skating right on the line of like good taste in terms of what you can literally expose children to. We also have another adult gag because, again, Tommy's insecure about how he seemingly can't grow hair, but Yvon grows hair all the time, all over his body. And he says, "Yvon grows hair in the places others only dream of." And just like, he's talking about his dick. Like, he's talking about his nut hair, I will say, I do also want to, I want to mention that there are a couple of times in this episode that I genuinely got a laugh. One of them was this really good visual gag where Yvon takes out this gigantic Swiss Army knife from like the package, and then in one big cartoonish swoop, he like shaves his chin. And it just, the way that they animated it was funny. I thought that was good.
Yeah, that's the thing about this show is like its animation's actually, this is obviously well before Flash, and there's a very distinct look to all the character designs. Now, some of them are like, it's very much erring on the side of caricature. Right?
Yeah.
Everybody's a caricature. Yvon, just take one look at Yvon and you know that's to be true. But they're all pretty good caricatures, like distinct designs. The show, now, here's the thing, it's hard to compliment because it's like the show absolutely has an aesthetic unto itself. It's just that the aesthetic is disgusting. Yeah. and it hurts me to look at. Things like Mega Babies and Ripping Friends were the same way. Those are really well animated shows, but they're just so hard to look at because they're just so foul and nasty. Yeah. And this show is the same way, where it's like, yes, it's all technically done well, it's all technically well drawn, but my goodness gracious, do I not like looking at it.
Especially in the case of the Ripping Friends, that was not only a show that was like meant to be disgusting, it was also like animated by the Ren and Stimpy guy, John Kay, and it's just like, oh, when he wants to be disgusting, it's one of the worst things you've ever seen. So at least there's no, like if John Kay worked on Yvon of the Yukon, we probably would have like actually seen his butthole or something. Mm-hmm. So Tommy's going to go out into the tundra. We get a couple scenes here where Yvon is mentoring Tommy about how to survive outside, and Big Bill gives Tommy a solid gold medallion. I liked this. There's actually a reference to Yellowknife, which is one of the cities in the Canadian North, because the medallion was won from a grocery store / casino there, and he gives it to him because it's like a symbol of manhood. Just one gross out moment here, where Tommy is being taught how to fish. He accidentally hooks Yvon's underpants, and it goes into the lake and kills the fish. I chuckled at that. Like, that's
yes.
And we also see
this made me laugh.
We also see Yvon's bare ass. Like, and that is far from the last time in this show you will see Yvon's ass. Like, get ready.
The idea that his underpants were so toxic that it was like, you ever read Kurt Vonnegut Cat's Cradle?
No.
Ice 9. In Cat's Cradle, there's Ice 9, and if one drop of it gets into the ocean, the whole ocean will freeze. And the idea that, like, Yvon's underpants are so filthy that, like, if you drop them into the water, it's going to kill all the surrounding fish because he's so disgusting.
Yeah. And we see that later with, like, we'll get into that. There's one thing I wanted to note here. Like, I didn't remember absolutely everything about this show. So, for example, I forgot that there's a local police character who's a woman who seems to be like a takeoff on Fargo. She has the very, very similar, like, Fargo accent. I also forgot about the character who is in the local jail, and he's like a stereotypical bald, muscle-bound inmate type of design, but he's got a very flaming accent. and I did not remember that, and I don't like it.
I need to see more of the show to see the way this character is portrayed. Like, I don't know if it's just the joke that he's just gay, or if the joke's that he's like a baby man.
No, I think that
because sometimes it's like both.
It's the joke is that he's gay. Like it came back to me watching this. I'm like, oh right.
You remembered
this
it
was
more.
the
Yeah,
repository
okay.
for gay jokes, which. How far we've come. Again, viewers beware. You're in for a scare of a more existential kind when watching Yvon of the Yukon. So Tommy goes into the tundra. Unfortunately, he goes there in the midst of a huge snowstorm. So Yvon goes after him to save him. We also have a B plot where two of the side characters, Harland, who is like a kind of backwoods yokel, and the Duke, who is an effete aristocrat, are planning to steal Tommy's medallion because they think it's real gold. So with Harland, I want to mention he's also related to a character named Big Mary, who we see a little bit of in this episode, who is this like large black woman who runs the local casino, and they're both married, and it's a not remarked on interracial couple, which I thought was cool. And then I found out that Big Mary's voice actor is white. So, like, Yvon of the Yukon giveth and taketh away in seemingly equal measure. A couple of adult gags at this point. So, we see Tommy going into the tundra. A bus of tourists pass by him, which is interesting. I thought that was interesting. Like, we mentioned Molly of Denali earlier, and I know Yvon of the Yukon came up when we were talking about that show. But that also has, one of the episodes we watched about that had to do with, like, white tourists coming to a different part of the country. So I thought that was interesting that they touched on it here. But then we see a polar bear go into the bus, and although they don't show any of this explicitly, the implication is that the bear ate and killed the tourists. You want to talk about, like, Family Guy jokes? Like, literally those people are dead. We just don't see the blood. There's also another reference, so... Again, the through line through part of this episode is that Harland and Duke are also in the middle of the snowstorm and trying to survive. They bring a tent with them. Harland makes a reference about how when he and Big Mary were on their honeymoon, they spent a week in the tent. And, like, normally it's a throwaway line, but they dwell on it. Like, they spend a couple of lines going over it where it's just like, me and Mary, we spent a week in that tent. And then the Duke's just like, you spent a week? And it's like, yeah, they banged. Like, hey, kids, those cartoon characters bang.
Soon after this is when we get the most, I feel like, adult joke of the entire episode.
Oh, my God. Yes.
I don't know which one is it. Is it Harland or is the other guy?
So Harland's the yokel, and so if you're talking about, are you talking about the railroad tracks?
Yes.
So the Duke gets his tongue stuck to railroad tracks. Go on, Lucas.
Yes, and so the yokel talks about how the only way to get your tongue unstuck from being frozen is to pour hot liquid on it, but there's no hot liquid to be found up there in the Yukon. And then he says, except, and then the camera's not showing him, it's showing Duke, and we just hear a zip, and I was literally at home watching this in full YouTube face, like mouth completely agape, thinking, no, there's no way, because obviously you're thinking, oh my God, he's gonna pee in his mouth, but then no, he had a hot water bag,
bottle.
whatever. Yeah, a hot water bottle in his backpack. That zipping was the sound of his backpack opening. But I can't believe it, Will, that he was gonna pee in his mouth joke. Like no parent has ever seen Yvon of the Yukon, as far as I'm concerned. Because, like, people were, there's people protesting Jackass and protesting South Park, being like, I'm scared my kid's going to see this. But you never heard any sort of controversy about Yvon of the Yukon. And in fact, it won Canadian Media Awards.
Yeah, and also, what was also interesting when I was researching it, like, apparently it was also pretty popular in England. Like, CBeebies ordered more seasons of it.
Wait. That's hilarious, Will. You want to know why that is? It's because they hate French people.
Oh, of course.
That's why it was so popular in England. That's so funny.
It's even closer to home. I also,
Yeah, if there's one thing the English love, it's humor about like racial caricatures and hating the French.
Yeah. In this whole fake out gag of like, haha, he almost pissed on his tongue, they also frame like in the same animation frame where you hear the zipper go down, Harland is positioned behind the Duke in a very suggestive way. Like, it almost looks like somebody made it up for fun on Twitter. Like, if you're going to watch this episode, like, keep your eyes open for that part. Like, holy crap. That of course went under my gross out moment. The other gross out moment of this part is Yvon breaks his leg, and you see, and like when you get a look at it, it's very cartoonish, but it's also like jagged in several places. It was kind of gross. It was gross in a different way than Yvon of the Yukon usually is. This doesn't fit into this episode here. I do just want to say, like, as an example of, again, the show's adult gags, I first found out about the phrase when somebody says, like, beer me?
Yes.
I found out about that from Yvon of the Yukon. Like, there's a different episode where Harlan says beer me. And I was like, I don't get it. And then found out that to mean give me a beer.
Like I said, foundational television, Will. We were all learning when Yvon of the Yukon came on, Will. I sat my Anglo ass down and listened.
Oh God, I'm so glad we talked about this. Tommy and Yvon, they end up getting swept away in a river. They take some real bad headers down a waterfall. At the same time, Big Bill is getting worried because he didn't mean to send Tommy out in the middle of a snowstorm. We go back to the jail, and so the cop's name is Luba, and I don't know what the prisoner's name is.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, you want to set this even further in time, not just with gross out humor, but Richard Simmons references. Remember when we all loved to make fun of Richard Simmons?
Yeah, this is one of the... Yeah. This is prior to him disappearing, and there's like being a podcast about him disappearing.
Right, exactly. Like it wasn't as rosy as we all thought it was for Richard Simmons. So
this also has my favorite joke of the whole episode, which is that Big Bill is worried, and he asks, we need to go out and find them because they're lost in the blizzard. And the cop's like, I'll organize a search party, and Big Bill just goes, well, I hardly think it's time for a party. And that got me. I don't know. It's like, at this point, Yvon of the Yukon had worn me down into so like it had worn me down so much. I was just happy there was like a setup and a punchline that didn't involve a butthole. You know what I mean?
I also want to note here. So you mentioned earlier that they say crap in this episode. So when they're doing the Richard Simmons routine, the prisoner like gets a cramp in his leg. And it sounds like he says crap. It sounds like crap, but I think it's cramp. But I can see why you thought that. They sound really similar in the way that he says it. So Yvon and Tommy, they end up being trapped in this cave during a storm. And also Yvon is basically like walking concussed because he took a header. There is a brief gag when they're floating down the river where a bear picks him up and like sniffs his underwear and throws him back. So it's like, again, Yvon stinks of shit so badly that even the wildlife doesn't want him. So in order to get through this, Tommy sees like this Force Ghost version of Big Bill, and the Force Ghost encourages him to follow a herd of musk ox. The only gross out moment that I found left, the last gross out moment of the show, is that Big Bill's Force Ghost is saying all this while he's on the John. Like he's in the porta potty, and then it's just like, close the door on your way out, eh? And like honestly, it could have been worse. It could have been a lot worse. So Tommy
really are at a there's a fairly good ratio of a gross out joke once every 2 minutes at least.
Yes.
Like, not 2 minutes go by without some sort of bodily humor taking place.
Yeah, just to make sure you're still awake. We see the musk ox, which Yvon and Tommy follow. How about the musk ox's running animation? It's literally just like, when Sonic would run in Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, and it would just be like a wheel blur underneath his torso? Yeah. They do that, but you can just see like hooves every now and then. It was a really odd and kind of cheap choice for that, but whatever. So Tommy follows the herd of muskox. They almost get attacked by a pack of wolves, but he uses the golden medallion to hypnotize them into thinking that they're sled dogs. And at this point, there's like 4 minutes left in the episode. I'm like, okay, sure, whatever. Like, get me out of here. So he takes them. They find Harland and Duke. They're frozen in ice, which, again, I did laugh. Duke and Harland are stuck in like a Three Stooges pose. So Duke has his 2 fingers out ready to gouge Harland's eyes, and he's got the one hand up to block them. So I thought that was kind of funny. So they bring everybody back to town. Tommy's a hero. He brings Harland and Duke there on this big ice block, and he says, "Don't worry, folks, they're not dead." To which everybody goes, "Aw." They get chased out of town once they're unfrozen, and the next morning, Tommy finds that he gets his first armpit hair, but due to wacky shenanigans of like Yvon tripping over bathroom tile or something, he accidentally plucks his one armpit hair and it falls down the drain. And that's the end of the episode. There's one more thing that I wanted to point out. So in terms of like finding an image for the episode, and also this is fairly prominent in like the stills the promotional stills for the cartoon. For some reason, they love to draw Yvon doing the hang 10. Like, you can see it in the corner of the credits. There's like a little yellow circle with an Yvon still in it, and he's doing the hang 10, like the shaka pose. And I'm like,
that is so
like,
odd.
what does that mean? Like, is that anything? Is that something? Why that? I don't know. So, in many ways, I feel like we got off light in terms of what we decided to do, but also, I mean, do you think what we saw was indicative of Yvon of the Yukon? And really, Lucas, watching it all these years later, like, was it as gross and offensive as you thought it was going to be? Was it better? How are you feeling?
Well, it was quite a small sample size, but I gotta say, my memory did not fail me, Will. It was about as gross and offensive as I remembered it being.
Okay.
Like, even from a child, like, even as a kid, you were a little bit older than me, so maybe it was a little bit more to your sensibility, but as a kid, I found it so gross that it was a little bit unsightly for my young eyes. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard. I almost am rendered. We have a podcast, Will. All we do is talk about cartoons every week. I'm almost rendered speechless by Yvon of the Yukon.
Wow.
I think it has to be. I think if you're American and if you've never seen this before, or if you're Canadian and you're like, oh yeah, I remember that show, it has to be seen to be believed. Mm-hmm. And that's not to say that it's good or anything like that, but I think that, you know, it's a good record of where we've been, how far we've come, and I think for those reasons, they should teach Yvon of the Yukon in schools, in Canadian media literacy, because I feel like the world is starting to forget about Yvon of the Yukon, Will, but I never forgot, and that's why we're here today.
Well, and I think it's indicative of how forgotten this is, that like nobody brings this up, because it's not like there's nothing to talk about. Like, it's, again, kind of miraculous that this was not only aired, but was kind of popular. Like, I watched it, you watched it, and I'm sure a lot of other Canadian kids watched and enjoyed it too. Like, I think you made a really good point of, like, it really succeeds at what it's trying to do. Like, I think that the designs for those characters are good. The animation at times is actually pretty good. The voice acting is really solid. The gross out gags and adult gags, like, if you're gonna go for that, they do those pretty well. Like, I got a couple of laughs here and there. It was not. I was kind of going into this expecting it to be like incredibly awful. Like, I was expecting this to be like one of the worst things I've ever seen. It really isn't. Like, honestly, some of the stuff we watched on For the Kids is worse from just like a quality standpoint, you know, in terms of just like, I would never want to watch it again. You might be able to convince me to watch another episode of Yvon just to be like, I can't believe this happened. Like, one of the episodes I had in mind for us to check out that we ultimately didn't decide on is actually based a lot around professional wrestling. There's a gross out moment in there where like one of the wrestlers literally like reaches into Yvon's body and pulls him inside out, so you see all of his musculature. It's like, and there's probably even more stuff that I forgot about. And yes, it's rather upsetting. And there's a couple of choices in there, whether it has to do with casting or production or the stories they tell or the characters they use or whatever, that are regrettable, that are really just like not worth remembering. But I'm surprised at this show in many ways. Like, again, it's just like, how did this get made? How did it air? But also, like, how is it not the worst thing you've ever seen? I don't know. So I guess that speaks to the inherent quality of a lot of people working on it.
No exaggeration, Will. All this aside, it is the first time in my life I saw Indigenous characters on TV, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. But it was the first TV show I ever saw, especially with Inuit characters, and especially with the main character being Inuit. I can't think of another show from that era that had something.
Well, I'm sure there are others. Like off the top of my head, Billy Two Feathers from Shining Time Station, which we talked about, but
that's not of my era, right?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point, and certainly not to this prominent degree. And I think that's a good thing. It doesn't outweigh some of the creepier, less racially sensitive stuff, but again, it really could have been worse. I feel like we dodged a couple of bullets here. So in terms of looking back on this, I don't know how many other ways to say it, but like, that actually wasn't all that bad. So it actually encourages me to continue to look back at cartoons of our past to see, really, maybe there was more there than we thought. Although I really don't think that this is what I would call a good cartoon. I'm just saying it's not the worst thing I've ever seen. And really, that in itself is a victory.
Yvon of the Yukon, it's like a really, really hefty poop. When you're going through it, you start to think to yourself, wait a minute, is this kind of enjoyable in a weird way? And then you're relieved when it's over. And sometimes during it, it's grossing you out in the process.
I don't care to follow that, so thanks for joining us for ECL Origins. Check out Yvon of the Yukon at your own risk, I guess, and we'll see you next month when we clean things up around here a bit and we go back to a show from PBS Kids. So for Lucas Mancini, I'm Will Young, and we'll see you next time. Oh my God, I can't believe I let you say that whole thing.